This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
African and Chinese leaders converged in Beijing this week for the third summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The two-day event saw a wide range of deals signed, with leaders reiterating commitment to the growing FOCAC partnership and elevating the platform to a new level. So in the midst of growing uncertainties in globalization and international trade, how will China and Africa navigate the future of their relations? And with both sides keen on boosting cooperation on a mutually beneficial and win-win basis, how will FOCAC 2018 shape China-Africa relations in the coming years? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa. Now, up to 53 African governments and the African Union Commission and at least 27 international organizations participated in the just concluded Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The summit resulted in 8 major initiatives between China and Africa, as well as a $60 billion pledge to be channeled towards development. CGTN's Christy Scull filed a wrap of the two-day summit.
A new era of win-win cooperation between China and Africa, and a new vision mapped out for its future development. At the opening ceremony of the FOCAC Forum in Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping unveiled 8 major initiatives for the next 3 years and beyond. The 8 major initiatives will cover areas such as infrastructure connectivity, trade facilitation, and green development. Xi says China will work closely with African countries under the 10 major cooperation plans and help build a closer community with a shared future. To ensure the successful implementation of the initiatives, China will provide Africa with $60 billion in the form of government assistance and financing from Chinese enterprises. It will be provided through loans, credit lines, and special development funds. Over the next 3 years, Chinese companies are encouraged to invest at least $10 billion into Africa. In the business forum held on the same day, President Xi encouraged entrepreneurs from both China and African nations to come to each other's markets and enhance business ties. The financial matters, like the visions by China, all received a warm welcome from African leaders at the event.
Many countries have the sense that in China we have a meaningful partner who is not just there to rape and plunder resources from the African continent, but a partner who wants to assist the fellow partners to reach higher levels of industrialization. So China is also going to support many African countries to industrialize.
At the roundtable meeting on day 2 of the forum, leaders adopted the Beijing Declaration on building a stronger China-Africa community and the Beijing Action Plan 2019 to 2021. The outcome and consensus reached at the forum will set guidelines for China and Africa in the coming years. And it's hoped that their time-honored friendship can become one of solidarity as well as common prosperity, not just for China and Africa, but also other countries around the world. Christy Scull, CGTN.
Well, the FOCAC 2018 summit saw a convergence of interest between China, Africa, and the global community, with Chinese President Xi Jinping announcing the harmonization of the Belt and Road Project, the African Union's Agenda 2063, as well as the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Africa will also see increased effort towards its share of trade with China. Our reporter Jen Keo has been in Beijing and tracked some of the key gains for the Africa from this summit.
2 days of intense dialogue covered a wide range of issues between China and African countries. President Xi Jinping and other African leaders hailed the meeting as fruitful.
China and Africa will join hands to build a China-Africa community with a shared future that features joint responsibility, a win-win cooperation, happiness for all, common cultural prosperity, common security, and harmonious coexistence.
Unveiled at the forum were the Beijing Declaration on Building an Even Stronger Community with a Shared Future and the 2019-2021 Action Plan, focusing on 8 new areas of cooperation. The latter will be laid out over the next 3 years and beyond. The cooperation areas include industrial promotion, trade, green development, and much more. This will be delivered under a new $60 billion development grant.
While conducting cooperation with Africa, international partners need to respect the sovereignty of African nations. We need to hear the African voice and deliver on promises made.
More than 50 African leaders descended on Beijing for the meeting, making it the biggest gathering since FOCAC's inception. They rallied behind President Xi's vision for Africa and China's involvement on the continent.
We all acknowledge that in order to reap the benefits of globalization and the rapid development of technology, we need to work even more closely together, and we need to share knowledge and capabilities amongst us.
China-Africa relations have entered a golden age. China and Africa trust each other. Our relations continue to move forward, and this is because our relation is based on a sincere friendship in the struggle for the decolonization of our countries and is based on principles of equality, mutual respect, and mutual benefit.
With the next summit scheduled for 2021, there is mutual optimism about the future of China-Africa relations. Jin Kyo, CGTN, Beijing.
And to get an in-depth analysis of the just concluded 2018 Beijing Summit of FOCAC, I'm joined in Johannesburg by Dr. Garth Lapere. He's a professor at the University of Pretoria. With me in Nairobi is David Awiro, an independent consultant economist, and Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute, joining us again. Thank you all, gentlemen, for joining us on the program. Dr. Lapere, start off with you in Johannesburg. The 2018 Beijing FOCAC Summit witnessed perhaps the highest attendance of African heads of state and governments there, international organizations. And it is taking place, though, amid a changing global scenario. Multilateralism, globalization under threat. First, what's your assessment of the 2018 FOCAC Summit?
Well, I think, it is an emblem of the maturation of the process. This is the 7th summit. The first was inaugurated in 2000. And I think over the 18 years of cooperation between China and Africa, there's been a great maturation in purpose, in outcomes, and in the focus. And this is based on a confidence and a trust that has been built through the cooperation agenda, where there is almost a shared sense of the philosophical foundations of FOCAC, as well as a sincerity to ensure that there are outcomes in terms of its operational and its programmatic agenda. And I think the 7th summit is probably a high watermark in giving life to the maturation of the FOCAC process over the life of 7 summits.
Right. David, your thoughts?
Well, one gets a sense that the FOCAC forum is sort of maturing. We see the pace of the discussions and the response that we've seen from the policy pronouncements. We sort of come away with a genuine effort for greater China-Africa relations. And of course, for me, I was excited about the expanded opportunities for this cooperation, especially the opportunities that now Africa has with the pronouncement that we saw in terms of announced aid, financial assistance, and so on. So it's certainly exciting.
Right. Professor, 53 African governments, the African Union Commission, and at least 27 international organizations at the summit. Do you think the evolving global environment played a role in making the FOCAC 2018 summit very successful?
First and foremost, one must recognize that in the last 18 years, FOCAC has emerged as the most important forum for the African people outside the African Union. It is the most attended, as you've mentioned, 53 countries represented, up from 49 in 2015. That's a huge number. Africans have not attended even the United Nations General Assembly in that number. The highest number you recorded was the 50th anniversary of the African Union. So this signifies how important the African people considers FOCAC to be. That's one. Two, FOCAC is also evolving as a Marshall Plan for the African continent. Since 1947, there has never been another major bailout in terms of targeting poverty, targeting the development, targeting the goal to create wealth and create prosperity. In this particular case, it is the first largest amount for Africa as a continent. That underlines why FOCAC is so important for the African people.
Dr. Lepere, let's look at some of the specifics, though. There, the 10-point plan backed by a $60 billion cash outlay in 2015, an additional $60 billion, an 8-point initiative in 2018. In which spheres, though, do you see this making the most transformative impact for the lives of African people?
Well, you know, the package with this summit is almost similar to the one that was offered at the South African summit in 2015. And the big challenge, of course, is to ensure that the distributional benefits that flow from these packages find traction and are equally distributed among the African countries that participate in the process. Remember that, you know, China has official relations with 53 African countries, and the majority of those are officially designated as least developed countries. Now, the big challenge, of course, is to ensure that the benefits flow to those countries in terms of their own growth and development imperatives. And I think, you know, what China is doing in terms of the menu of 10 different dimensions of cooperation are the kind of strategic areas that will, over the long term, really benefit African countries' growth and development. The immediate challenge, however, is how this is located within the continental templates of development and integration, particularly with regard to Agenda 2063 and the recently agreed Continental Free Trade Agreement. How will the FOCAC process then find an interface or build a synergy with these continental programs to ensure that, you know, there is broad continental traction? And for me, this is really the second generation of challenges in the FOCAC process to ensure that there are continent-wide benefits that will lift the billion-plus people of the continent out of
David,
the current state.
Let me just come back to you on that issue of the least developed countries and how they will benefit here. Because on trade facilitation, China says it will increase imports, especially non-resource products from Africa, and least developed African countries will be exempted from paying exhibition stand fees on the international exhibition arena. How can Africa, though, exploit this opportunity?
Certainly, I think the big onus is now on African governments, and here is to put in place an enabling policy environment to realize the action plan that the FOCAC is laying out. As regards increasing the imports opportunities for African nations to China, the big issue has always been that Africa is exporting primary or raw commodities, but mostly resources. And given that this particular initiative that is now being pronounced at the FOCAC focuses on non-resource-based export opportunities for African nations, this certainly will go a long way in not only building an industrial class, but also ensuring that we have a robust manufacturing sector that perhaps can become even globally competitive.
Right. So, Prof, we did see that there was quite a push for a business-to-business discussion here. And President Xi asked Chinese business to be a link between China and Africa, and did actually ask Chinese companies to try and invest about $10 billion in Africa over the coming 3 years. Is there more emphasis now on the role the private sector can play on the continent?
Yes, and that role is important given the priority post-Johannesburg, now post-Beijing, because a lot of infrastructure has been built in Africa, and the challenge is how do we get that infrastructure to pay for itself? Support by governments alone, particularly from the Chinese government, may not be sufficient to give the economic growth that kick it requires to be able to pay, to make the investment pay for itself. And therefore, you will need a lot of private investments, both from China and from other parts of the world. That's why FOCAC, although it's a China-Africa platform, this year attracted more than China and Africa participation, including international participation, in order to draw in other investors onto the continent to be able to make the infrastructure and other investments made grow. Remember also, we are entering into manufacturing. Industrialization is top on the agenda, and industrialization will require input in terms of capital beyond the partners within FOCAC.
Right. So, Dr. Lapere, in terms of manufacturing and Africa entering into the industrialization area, President Ramaphosa, though, did say that both leaders from China and Africa had agreed to work to increase Africa's value-added exports to China and see real meaningful trade taking place between both China and Africa. Are we seeing measures in approaches, though, from the forum to help Africa's value add?
Well, I think, there have been measures that have been put in place. Remember that I think from a strategic and policy perspective, the pendulum has really swung in terms of what are the catalysts and what are the drivers of China's engagement in Africa. This has shifted from state-owned enterprises to Chinese public firms. So this gives them the greater flexibility to engage in the kind of public-private partnerships that can drive the new frontier of growth and development, which has to be based on building Africa's industrial capacity on the one hand, and on the other, building its capacity to add value to its resources in agriculture. So what President Ramaphosa was saying has great resonance with the FOCAC process. Because if we look at the big challenges that are articulated through Agenda 2063 and the Continental Free Trade Agreement, they anticipate that Africa will move from the basis of primary commodity production and export into value addition for both domestic consumption, for improving the quantum of intra-regional trade, as well as building its global competitiveness. That is really the next frontier of Africa's development, and it has to be driven by the calculus of industrialization. Right.
We're going to take a short break now, but do stay tuned for more expert analysis of the 2018 Beijing Summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Both my guests in studio, Professor Peter Kagwanja and David Owiro, still here with me, and of course joining us from South Africa, Dr. Garth Lapere, a professor at the University of Pretoria. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. My expert guests are on standby. In Johannesburg, Dr. Garth Lepere, professor at the University of Pretoria. And with me in studio is Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute, as well as David Owiro, an independent consultant economist. Professor Kagwanja, peace and development remained underlying factors and the focus of the 2018 summit. China already has over 2,000 of its peacekeepers in 5 UN operations, contributing the largest troops to Africa and brokering peace behind the scenes. Why is China attaching so much importance to security issues?
With an investment now amounting to about 120 billion, any country will be concerned about the stability of the environment in which you are investing. And therefore, if you are to help the Africans in terms of enjoying the prosperity that comes from this kind of support, security, political stability, and a degree of certainty are important. And therefore, one does not see China as an interventionist power beginning to flex its military muscle. What we see is a very subtle combination of peacekeeping, conflict resolution, mediation, and other instruments of soft power. The involvement of the military is very limited. And therefore, the agenda of peace and security during the FOCAC summit basically underlined the need for China and Africa to cooperate not just on peace and security, but also on governance in order to create a stable environment for the 8 points that President Xi Jinping outlined. You need stability in order to have industrialization. You need stability in order to have long-term planning and implementation of the things that have been agreed upon. Therefore, peace and security is a key agenda, but you can see where it is coming in the 8 points. It's at the bottom, meaning military or militarism is not really China's priority. Priority is industrialization, but the environment is key.
Right, security is key as well, but for trade to grow and, for security as well as connectivity are key issues. The Belt and Road Initiative, one of the issues there brought about aligning that to Agenda 2063 as well as the SDG goals. Why these three? Why are they important for Africa?
I think it's very important because for the first time we are seeing convergence of priority and vision from a global economic context that takes into account the African development challenges. And so Agenda 2063 not only espouses our African challenges, but also goes a step to identify the key priority initiatives that as Africans we feel should be the priority that will advance us to the development goal that we have. And so aligning that, and given that it takes into account the UN's Sustainability Development Agenda for 2030, as well as visioning that within the Belt and Road Initiative, certainly makes sure that African priorities not only are visioned within the African goals, but also the broader global economic context.
Right. Dr. Lepere, how do you see aligning the Belt and Road Initiative with Africa's Agenda 2063? How do you see that, as well as launching of the Continental Free Trade Area? How do you see that spurring Africa's modernization and industrialization?
I think that the major challenge is to ensure the facilitation of trade based on the free movement of goods and services across such a large land mass. And I think, the connectivity will be very important in terms of both, land movement of goods and services, as well as the maritime connectivity. Remember that the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, involves 65 countries. And to the extent, that there is going to be a synergy between the continental programs and the Belt and Road Initiative, and to the extent, that the FOCAC processes can be integrated into this in terms of developing a strong operational interface. It all depends on how African countries respond to the opportunities, the risks, and the challenges that are embedded in this process. Because, we have to get the continental agenda right. We have to improve, the environment for governance. We have to improve the environment through which, policies have traction in terms of the integration agenda. And we have to improve, the performance of African economies. That is why the industrialization imperative and the imperative to build Africa's industrial capacity is very important, particularly since China is planning to outsource almost 85 million jobs.
Right. So I'm going to get a final comment from all of you gentlemen before we wind up, because we're running out of time here, because I just want to get one final point from you all. What transformations, though, would you want to see, Professor, very briefly, as we look towards the next FOCAC in 3 years' time?
As we get to the next FOCAC, we want to see deepening of industrialization, which means modernization of African economies. We want to see more investment by the private sector, both from China, from Africa, and globally. We want to see more globalization, the opening up of the markets and so on. And we want to see more trade between China and Africa, but in that trade, where Africa's goods are not just raw materials, but there's the value addition, meaning they're raising the value of the goods up to the value chain in the global market. I want to see a more prosperous Africa in 3 years.
Right, David?
Well, my expectation is that African governments will put in place measures to implement what has been agreed going forward. And one of the key goals is, of course, for Africa to grow its intra-African trade, so that we can have not only a growth of our value-added commodities, but also a growth of our manufacturing class within Africa. And hopefully this will enable us to integrate into global economic opportunities, riding on the leadership of China within the global economy.
Dr. Lapierre, you have the final word. What transformations would you like to see across the continent over the next 3 years, very briefly?
I would like to see, better coordination between FOCAC and, other partnership arrangements. Remember that FOCAC is not an exception here. There are 7 other partnership arrangements that Africa has, from the European Union, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, India, and so on. And I'm afraid that, African countries on their own, as well as the African Union, do not have the absorptive capacity to manage so many different layers of partnership arrangements. I think it would be useful to bring these together in one envelope so that you can have better returns to scale in terms of driving a much deeper and wider growth and development agenda for the continent.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. We'll leave it there for today. And that's all we have time for tonight on Talk Africa. This has been our special coverage of the 2018 Beijing Summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. A thank you to my expert panel of guests in Johannesburg, Dr. Garth Lapierre, professor at the University of Pretoria, David Owiro, an independent consultant economist based in Nairobi, and Professor Peter Kagwanja, president and the CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. The conversation goes online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter, and you can also catch the show on the CGTN Africa website and our YouTube playlist. Remember to tune in again for more Talk Africa from me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi. Goodbye.